everyone, this is Rick Grantham. I'm coming to you today from a hotel in Denver, Colorado, where I've been pulled away for a consulting assignment. But what I want to walk you through today is the results of an email that I got recently from a client. The client was looking to build some dashboards, and basically the CFO, the person in charge of finance, wanted to go out and start whiteboarding his own dashboards to figure out, and wanted a process that he could go through to figure out what his requirements are without bringing in a whole lot of technical people. You know, is there a process he could go through to kind of figure out what his requirements are? So what I want to walk you through today are the results of what I provided as advice to this client. First off, I want to bring your attention to two resources. Resource number one is a website, which I'll post in the description of this email or of this video, called the BI Dashboard Formula, which is a website by Miko Yuk, who provides basically training on exactly how you would put together a dashboard or a process for making that happen. So that's a good resource for you. Miko is on the speaking circuit quite a bit for Business Objects conferences around dashboards. Resource number two to bring to your attention would be some of the writings of Dr. Berg. And it's particularly on the Insider Learning Network. He has a very good blog post, which I will link to as well, called Getting Excelsius Requirements, a Real Example. So I provided both of these links, of course, to my customer. But in addition to that, I just want to walk you through some of my thoughts on the best way to go about handling this type of problem. In subsequent videos, I'll go into much more detail on each of the steps and what I think is the best way to go about handling this. So first off, step number one. And let's assume that you've gotten through the planning stage and and now you're actually ready to start movement on gathering your requirements. First step, which aligns pretty closely with Dr. Berg's thinking, is really data scope, right? And so go through a process to where you're figuring out what data is actually available for your dashboards. There's no point in building a lot of dashboards and mock-ups for things that are in dreamland, right? That you really don't have any sort of data to support. So step number one, data scope. What's in scope, what's out of scope, and within this data scope even is what are the calculations, right? How are you going to go about calculating those KPIs? A detailed definition of data scope. That's first step. Anything, it's got to be in the dashboard of anything you're going to do later in the process. You really need to have your data defined on that. Step number two, and this is probably the funnest step, right, which is whiteboarding. So with this, you look at a lot of the different gauges and just get in front of a big whiteboard with your executive of the KPIs that are available, of the measurements and the data that's available from your first step. And step two, you're figuring out what your gauges are going to look like, where they're going to be, what sort of dimensions is the executive going to want to drill down on, what sort of measures, how do they want the graphs to look, how do they want to be able to navigate what works best for them. Once you finish the whiteboarding process, really a good third step, step number three, is your query mockup. So in a query mockup, this is really taking the data that you have from your whiteboarding session and figuring out in Excel, start listing the data and data elements of exactly what you would need to populate, the data you would need to populate to be able to support the dashboard. And with this, you're getting field names, you're getting the formats for numbers, you're getting formats for currencies, etc., and getting all of this so that you have an idea of the sort of data that you're going to need to populate the dashboard that you just whiteboarded. Fourth step, now that you've done this, is really to take the dashboard that you did on the whiteboard, the whiteboarding session, and do some Excel prototyping. Start getting some of the data that you had in Excel that you did in the previous step, and start to create a dashboard in Excel, that looks very similar to what was done on the whiteboard. So this then becomes something that your executives can start to play with, which then brings you to your next step, step number five. Now that you've done this in Excel and you have a prototype, shoot this out to your executives, sit down with them, elicit feedback. At this point, you still haven't even touched the dashboarding tool yet, right? This is all just requirements gathering and making sure that you fully documented what the executives want. So during the feedback process, I'll walk you through some steps how to do that in subsequent videos as well. And now that you've done this, you really get to a step to where you're finally at this point doing your mock-ups in Excel, in Excelsius, or whatever your dashboarding tool is. Excelsius is one of my favorite tools within Business Objects to be able to do dashboards. So at this point, now that you have the feedback, you have everything from your executives, you have an idea of what the Excel query is going to look, or what the queries are going to look like, what the data is going to look like. Take that next step and actually build it in your dashboarding tool like Business Objects, Excelsius. And now for your last step, now that you've actually done this mock-up and cleared this mock-up in Excelsius, your final step is really getting management feedback. Shoot this off to them in a SWIFT file or something that they can play around in so they can start to play with the data really before you've made any of the connections at all to BW, SAP BW, or what your real data sources are. So that's about 6 or 7 steps there, a process that you can follow. And really for those first 3 or 4 steps, you really didn't even need a technology person, right? You just needed to know the data that's in scope, the data that's available, and really what you want your dashboard to look like and to start playing with that in Excel. So, in subsequent videos, we'll walk you through in a lot more detail how to do each one of those steps in the best way for your business. Until next time, this is Rick Grantham.